All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Duarte Moraes. I'm a tourism professor at NC State in the United States, and I'm really honored to be a co-founder of these webinar series. My colleagues, co-founders, and mentors, Professor Jafar Jafari, he is joining us today as well, and hopefully he'll have maybe a question or a contribution later on in the webinar. And my colleague Kazem Fafadari from Japan, he's also here. He's kind of controlling the technical details of this webinar. So thank you so much, Kazem. So as you can see on this initial slide, this webinar series tries to fill a gap. We felt like around maybe for many years, but certainly with the beginning of the pandemic, we started seeing a lot of webinars coming out, rescuing or coming to the help of communities and businesses and hotels and the industry. But most of those efforts seem to be addressing the needs of the formal sector of tourism. And the informal sector, the communities, the micro businesses, they are actually a really substantial, if not the most substantial component of the industry and of the phenomena of tourism, and they just are often understudied and underhelped. And there's not a lot of collaboration, including them, to create knowledge that they might need. So we're trying to use technology to make the creation of useful knowledge a little bit more democratic and more easily accessible. All right, so that's our vision, is that group that we're here today and other groups that we interact with in these monthly webinars, we're exchanging ideas and listening to perspectives, addressing questions so that it's useful knowledge to the base of the tourism industry in the world. Okay, so I'm delighted to be just your host, and I'm going to pass the word very quickly to our moderator for this session. But first, I wanted to just run you through a few tips for us to have a successful webinar. The first thing is that I would like all of the participants to have the camera off and the sound, the microphone muted. That way, the bandwidth is spared and we have less interferences and better quality. I would really like, it would be great if all the participants would participate with questions. Please do so with the chat feature. I am going to be diligently here, quiet most of the time, taking notes of questions, looking for themes, and then towards the end, I'll be sharing them with the moderators so that the panelists can address your questions. But please do engage actively that way, okay? You should know that the webinar is being recorded. It'll be on our website on scottwebinars.org. And actually, our previous webinars are also there with information like articles and reports related to the theme. So the participants, the panelists today, they will be giving us some of their work. We'll put it on that webinar page, and you can then use this page to reference back to the recording of today, share it with students, share it with your business partners, so that what we do here today, our discussion can be watched many, many, many times, hopefully if it's necessary. All right. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to my esteemed colleague and dear friend, Kelly Bricker. She is coming to us from Utah, but a land of cold and very good snow from what I hear. But the reason she is at the helm of today, besides the fact that a lot of us know her and really respect her work, is that she spent a lot of time in Fiji, made friendships and made impact in communities there. And so she's here to moderate the session. So without further ado, Kelly, the cyber floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Duarte. I actually wish I was where my background is right now, which is the upper Navua river corridor in the rural highlands of Viti Levu. I think most of you know that the purpose of this webinar is to bring light into how to explore the pandemic and how it's affecting ecotourism communities in the South Pacific. And we have the good fortune of having community leaders and academics as part of this program today. So I'm honored to be here and honored to be affiliated with this wonderful group of people. So I have the good fortune of having a long history in Fiji and working with people to conserve natural resources of the marine and terrestrial environments. We moved, my husband and I, to Fiji in 1998 to start what we had hoped to be a successful ecotourism project and in the rural highlands of Livelihoods. At that time, back in the day, the tourism industry in Fiji was growing, and it had about 410,000 overseas visitors who spent about 600 million in foreign exchange directly in the country, and was directly or indirectly responsible for about 40,000 jobs at that time in the formal sector. The recognition of ecotourism was also coming to light to the government. Sorry about that. And what they did was create an ecotourism policy in 1999. And this ecotourism and village-based policy was a strategy really to enhance ecotourism work in Fiji and in the islands. And they defined at that time ecotourism as a form of nature-based tourism, which involves responsible travel to relatively undeveloped areas to foster an appreciation of nature and local cultures, while conserving the physical and social environments, respecting the aspirations and traditions of those who are visited, and improving the welfare of local people. And so that's kind of when we got engaged, when the government was really excited about ecotourism and doing quite a few initiatives at that time. So this policy that was created had 5 main principles, and I think we tried to adopt those in the project, which I'll tell you a little bit about, that we started. And that ecotourism should actually be complementary but not compete with more conventional forms of tourism. That tourism should take a second place to conservation, and at times may be banned in some instances or restricted in areas considered especially vulnerable. And that successful implementation of the ecotourism policy could only be achieved through social cooperation. So the idea of stakeholder engagement was fairly prominent at that time. In addition, information on village-based tourism should be centrally available and regularly monitored, and successful implementation of the policy would be based on the existence of strong and effective institutions to support these projects. Among many other matters covered in the policy document was the need to develop an awareness of the physical and cultural environments in Fiji. And since most of the tourism development was occurring in the islands and really along the coastal areas and major urban areas, the policy also focused on rural communities and the need to enhance the quality of life in remote villages, and really advocating for fiscal and other incentives to help village-based projects and develop necessary skills and capacity. The policy also committed the government to clarify rights of ownership and thus avoid conflicts over these various types of tourism development projects. So it was at that time, at that juncture, that we started Rivers Fiji. We became keenly aware of many Matangali, or village groups living along the upper Navua River, and keenly dependent on the natural resources to support their daily lives and the health of that resource. And the upper Navua is actually Fiji's 3rd largest freshwater drainage, and drains right into Banga Lagoon, which is one of the soft coral capitals known to the world today, which has its own set of complementary health benefits. But suffice to say, we understood the connection the people of the highlands have with the river and the rich resources they depend upon. as well as the significant threats to the health of the river and ultimately to that Benga Lagoon that's so important. And these threats came in the form of mining and unsustainable mining, hydropower potential, and illegal logging activities. So our whole purpose of really engaging in this project was to build awareness of conservation and the importance of these freshwater drainages to the health of communities and the health of the nation, and build awareness and education as part of the project. So to really help everyone in the country understand the value of these amazing river corridors, to add to this rural economic development that was so important to the policy and the ecotourism policy, obviously in that development, create jobs, and also create a new sector that was largely ignored, which is the amazing tropical freshwater environments in the country. So prior to the pandemic, Fiji, at this time in history, was now up to about 900,000 visitors per year. And tourism continued to support approximately 34% of the GDP. I just read a recent article, which was pretty significant. So obviously the pandemic has had incredible impact on what's happening with the tourism industry, and especially some of the small ecotourism operators, and I can vouch for that personally, for Rivers Fiji. And I wanted to share just some of the things that we've learned from this project, and maybe in thinking about some of the presentations that we have today and how they complement each other. But we learned a lot over this wonderful time span that we've spent with Rivers Fiji. We learned that a really small ecotourism operation can have positive economic benefits on a region typically cut off from the benefits of tourism, adding economic diversity and new community opportunities. We also learned that the economic and social benefits have given communities and government political capital. So when the Upper Navua was number 2 or number 1 on a hydropower list of dam sites, it became number 2 because of those social economic benefits for those people living along the river. And then there's been several ancillary, and I think some folks will be talking about this today, but ancillary health benefits and well-being activities that typically stem from these small operations, such as improvement of schools, access to education and training and capacity building, health clinics, and improved technology. And we've also seen this project be an impetus for further conservation efforts up in the rural highlands. So we know that conservation of nature is vital to our existence in many ways, and this is especially prominent and felt daily for small island states. And I think you'll hear these stories today. For example, each time a species might go extinct, the world around us unravels a bit more. The consequences are profound, and not just in those places for those species, but for all of us. These are tangible, consequential losses, such as crop pollination and water purification, as we see up in the Upper Navua, but also spiritual and cultural ones. So we know that nature's goods and services are the ultimate foundations of life and health, and the quality of the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and many other features of our natural environment play a significant role in these health outcomes. We hope today, this evening or afternoon or morning, or wherever you may be joining us from, that these presentations and discussions ahead of us will help to highlight these linkages so critical to the Republic of Fiji and other small island nations in the South Pacific. And hopefully garner some ideas about how to build continued resilience in the face of pandemics, cyclones, and future development. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest today, Patricia Bibi, who is originally from the province of Takandro in Fiji, has a Master's of Business from Southern Cross University. Her thesis focused on tourism, Indigenous women, and empowerment in her home island of Taveuni. Beautiful place to go scuba diving. She has worked extensively in Fiji's tourism and hospitality management, including her experience as international cruising and airline spaces. She currently works as a researcher on the Pacific Agricultural Research and Development Initiative. Patricia is passionate about developing agritourism in the Pacific and more widely extending the benefits of tourism. She has also been involved in research work on Indigenous women's empowerment in tourism, agritourism, and water, sanitation, and hygiene practices in Fiji's tourism sector. Welcome, Patricia.
Vinaka Vakalevu Kelly, Mbula Vinaka, and warm greetings from Suva, Fiji. Thank you for the introduction, Kelly. So I'm just to correct Kelly a bit there. The project I'm on is the Pacific Agribusiness Research and Development Initiative, and it's funded by the Australian government. While we focus on agribusinesses, agritourism is one of the objectives that we work in, and I am sort of currently leading that work. So yes, Kelly mentioned that I'm from Taveuni, and if you see on that slide there, the 180 meridian goes through the island, my home island, and that's also where I focused my master's thesis on, and I am going to be sharing some of the findings in my talk this afternoon. Okay. So in Fiji, to do research work, we have we do it in a social setting, and the dialogue is called Talanoa, and the pictures you can see now are pictures of some a Talanoa session while research work is being done. And like anywhere else in the Pacific, research or social gatherings are always centered around food. So those are two communities in which I did research with, and one of them is the women in one of the villages that that has a lot of its members in the that work for the hotel industry. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures of from when I did my fieldwork. That laptop, that machine has crashed, so I wasn't able to get that up on. So I was asked if I could share in the areas of the benefits and shortcomings of involvement in ecotourism. When I carried out my master's thesis with the women, most of them, a good number of them worked in the community-based tourism operations, and a few of them were ecotourism operations. So as like anything else, the economic benefits to the community members were the highest levels of benefits. And focusing on women, my research evolved around was highly influenced by the Regina Cheving's empowerment framework. And I focused on the empowerment of women in the economic, social, and political and psychological spaces. Overall, women were empowered through their work in tourism, and the high levels of empowerment were in the economic and psychological levels. You know, they like anything else, they were able to have, they had money, they had control over their money, and that's something which I found, I was surprised to find, because in the indigenous Fijian setting, it's a very patriarchal setting where, you know, the men make most of the major decisions with regards to the household, to the village, and to the tribe, or the Matangali, as Kelly had mentioned. So to hear this from the women, that was something new for me, even though in some areas I had a bit of area, but this kind of finding this out was a confirmation to me of the women, the involvement of women, the importance of women in these communities. So they had control over their money. In some cases, when both the men and women were working, both husband and wife rather, it was the husband would give his paycheck to his wife to make financial decisions for the family. They were improved living standards. They had good. These women had good houses. They had luxury. They were able to afford luxury items in terms of having refrigerators, television sets, ovens and stoves, and these are in the villages. And some of them were able to get vehicles. Besides vehicles, also fiberglass boats, which was their side business for venturing into fishing and selling fish. And with the vehicles, they usually paid someone to drive it around so others could hire them. And also, additionally, some of these women were able to pay, who had farms, had laborers. So they were able to pay their laborers from from their wages, from their work in the tourism, tourism and hospitality space. The women in the areas of social empowerment, they were members of social groups within the village. And they were very influential too. Many of them, most of them, if anything, they were role models within their family and extended family, offering advice of schoolwork or anything to do with businesses, or just any general advice. And they were their views, these women's views, were very much welcome in village forums or village meetings. And with the two village headmen I spoke with, they said, they valued the women's contribution because women made things work. They admitted that if they've seen the difference when no women were part of any of the village committees, hardly anything moved. But when women were part of these committees, they actually saw actions being done. And more so with women that worked in the tourism industry, they brought to the village whatever knowledge they knew while working in the hotels or wherever they did. And this was through besides learning from their colleagues, most of it was through the interactions with the guests. And as I mentioned, there were positive life experiences for the children, especially, besides being able to send them to school, every day with fully equipped with their stationery, their uniform and lunches. Some of these children who lived on site were able to interact with the visitors in terms of just having regular chats, cultural exchange. Some of the women mentioned that she made a point to buy the newspapers, and they would come home and read it together with their children and discuss the news. And all of them were entrepreneurship minded, and 90% would say had little businesses at home, sort of like canteens. And as I had mentioned earlier, for those that had vehicles, these were hired out. For those that had fiberglass boats, they paid their the brothers or uncles or cousin brothers to fish, and they'd sell this fish. The major shortcomings of the community's involvement in ecotourism, and especially in community-based ecotourism operations, was tensions amongst community members. Because in Fiji, especially, when there is for the two villages, two of the villages I visited, I studied in Taviuni, they set the operations were on Matangali land or the tribe. So it's not, so in a village, there could be more than 2 tribes, and not everyone in the village belonged to the tribe where the operation set. So, you know, that the tension or, you know, forms of jealousy, and especially with women, you know, the gossips and everything else that went around, and that usually created, for some of the women I spoke with, it created friction, even though, you know, they would mean well to the other women that were not part of the committee or were not employed by the operation, but they could still feel tension that, oh, you are just saying that because you earn money or because you have a job or because, you know, you interacting with all these people and we're just at home. But these women say they offer whatever assistance they offer to the communities, it's for the benefit of the communities. On the impact of COVID-19 livelihoods, this was on another research I worked with as a research assistant for the Massey University, where Api, one of our, who's going to present after me, worked on. So as part of this and this study, and this was on a village who's who are landowners of Ndanarau Island, which is an integrated resort development. It's a big village, and majority of the villages there work in the on that island, on Ndanarau, and yeah, there's over 100 households in the village of Narewa. So the impacts were, as we all know, that it was, you know, all throughout the world, the loss of regular and steady income flow. Their psychological well-being was being affected, and this led to health issues of high stress levels, high blood pressure, just because they didn't know how they would be able to meet the financial commitments, such as loans and paying of bills, because most of these villages own their own homes, so they don't pay rent, but it's everything else. And, you know, putting food on the table, sending the children to school. But one of the upsides of it was, now because most of them worked on in the hotel, you know, they never fully utilized the land and the marine resources. So a lot of them said, you know, because of this, we're going back to gardening, going back to farming and fishing. And, you know, it's all coming back to us, what we usually did when we were children during the school holidays. So they admitted that in a way, it's good that we're going back to the land and cultivating it. They also mentioned, especially for the youths, the realization of the need to upskill, you know, take up trade courses or doing something outside the tourism sector, because this shock has confirmed to them that, you know, totally putting their eggs in one basket is not really a good idea. And also many of them had the opportunity to run their own businesses. In the village I went to, there were children going around selling muffins from house to house, or you know, sending out messages that lunch packs were being prepared and, you know, these were being sold. And these were hotel workers that worked in the kitchen or in the restaurant, that whose expertise and their skills, they were using it in the village to be able to at least get some income. And for those that you know, weren't in the food and beverage areas, you know, those that were in the landscaping at the hotel started forming ideas to do come together and do grass cutting around the village and into neighboring villages and get their services paid for. The other thing was the budget. A few of them admitted that before, you know, they never knew what budget was, but now they've had to draw budgets, weekly budgets, and that has really helped them. And they said, you know, this is something that will carry forward after COVID, or if we return to work when global travel resumes. And a few...
Just one more minute, okay?
Okay, all right. And again, more time, family time, because there were some members of the family who were airline workers or in the resorts, and we know how shift works operates.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Wow, that was just packed with so much information on and a really important insight into some village life and how people are adapting, but also the transference of tourism skill sets into daily life and how they can transfer that into trying to recover a living during this pandemic. So incredibly helpful. I believe we'll go ahead with our next presentation. And so if you have questions, please don't hesitate to jot them down in the chat, and we'll definitely return to those after we have our presentations. So our next guest is a good friend and a very active citizen in Fiji as well, doing some great things. And her name is Marita Manley, and she's the director of Talanoa Treks and Talanoa Consulting, and is a resource economist by background. She has worked in Fiji across agriculture and forest policy, food security, climate resilience, enterprise development, and is the founder of, and has done that work for over 15 years. She is the co-founder of Talanoa Treks, and this is a social entrepreneurial enterprise that's working in partnership with 4 interior communities in Fiji. And she also serves as the secretary for Duavada Sustainable Tourism Collective, which I hope we'll hear a little bit about today, and a management council member of Nature Fiji Marangeti Viti in the region to ensure that tourism meets the needs and priorities of communities in Fiji and actually strengthens cultural heritage and environmental conservation. But also that operators in this segment of the market are in real danger of not surviving the current crisis. And so acknowledges this and is trying to do a lot of work to assist in this regard. So welcome, Rita Bisabulavanaka.
Bula Kelly and everybody, I hope you can hear me okay. Just let me know if you can't and there are any problems. So if we could go on to the next slide. As Kelly was mentioning, my name's Marita, and we work in partnership with 4 rural communities as part of Talanoa Treks. So the ladies you can see in the photo, Ranandi, who's the nearest to the camera, is one of the members of the tourism committee in Nambalasere, which is a beautiful community up in the interior of Ra. And when we developed Talanoa Treks in partnership with the communities that we work with, we took a fair amount of time, as you need to do, working out what was going to work for them and making sure that the business model really centered around the way that they wanted to welcome tourists, but also to ensure that they were being supported to develop their own small businesses that would manage the tourism operations within their communities. So next slide, please, Kelly. So in relation to community benefits, the 4 rural communities that we work with have been supported through various means in terms of training, but also mentoring to establish and run their own small enterprises. And they do that within the context of the traditional Fijian setting. So they each started with a tourism committee within each village. And that is gradually transitioning to formal enterprises. And that transition is happening while they've got experience under their belt, you know, of running a business and knowing what running a business and the financial management associated with that means. So as Patricia was alluding to, we have, you know, thousands of people that have tourism expertise in the country. But running their own businesses is something that's not necessarily given much support from a policy level. And so we really wanted to try and demonstrate that that can work as a model. So the enterprises are contracted for their services as guides, cleaners, cooks, and they manage everything at the enterprise level. So it will be one payment that goes to the community enterprise, and the community enterprise then distributes those that revenue in proportion to services provided. And part of that has obviously been various infrastructure improvements to support the community to host. So we're a hiking company. We do multi-day hikes from community to community. And that has involved upgrading infrastructure such as communal kitchens, bathrooms, to be able to obviously host guests, but these communal facilities are also used for the wider community. And one of the things that we're doing at the current time in terms of COVID is to try and make better use of the communal kitchens to support the women with agricultural value-added products. Some slightly less tangible benefits from the kind of main economic benefits or the visible benefits is part of what's happened over the 6 or 7 years that we've been operating is that within the guides themselves, who are all obviously from the community. So we have very, very strong intent from the beginning that all of the guides that are from the communities that we work with. It's been an opportunity for many of them to reconnect to their own cultural heritage. So many of the places that we walk, where we hike, there are obviously various cultural stories and history that are connected to those places. And what was interesting is some of the younger guides didn't actually know some of those stories, or didn't know about why, you know, their village had relocated 80 years ago. Didn't know about some of the pre-Christian worship sites in detail. So that's been an opportunity for them to connect with their elders and to understand a little bit more about their own cultural heritage in sharing that information with guests. It's also helped around, you know, leadership skills. So whether that's actually managing groups on the hikes, or things like managing, so with respect to the kitchens, the women actually managed the contracts with the contractors to upgrade those kitchens. So it gave the women's groups an opportunity to actually manage a formal, you know, construction contract, which has led to increased confidence around many aspects. But one of the kind of positive things I think has been the issue around that confidence also of being proud of their own cultural heritage, proud of the food that they're serving to guests. I think the slide has moved on. I don't know whether that was deliberate or not. If you could just go back to the last one. And then obviously around environmental conservation, we have a leave no trace policy, which then obviously filters into kind of wider conversations with the communities and within the communities around issues such as littering, burning, and wider environmental conservation measures. Next slide, please. In terms of the impact of COVID-19, our model was very deliberately set up such that communities weren't dependent on tourism income alone. So these are very rural, remote communities. And in starting the business, we were very conscious that we didn't want to we wanted to make sure that the communities would never become solely dependent on tourism income, but that it would be a useful addition to their agricultural income. So thankfully, as they're mainly agricultural communities, their tourism income decline has not led to massive changes in terms of personal income, apart from those who guided very regularly. Obviously, there's been an impact in terms of the agriculture space because they mainly sell to Nandi, Lautoka and Ba, which are areas with massive tourism demand. So that has affected things through that. They are very highly resilient communities, but obviously remote and somewhat marginalized through inaccessibility of services. And that COVID-19 has just added to the stress of that. For some of them who were dependent on remittances from families in urban areas, that has led to a reduction in the remittances from family members that may have been working in the tourism industry. But in general, they are much more resilient than any communities that are close to urban centres or that have been dependent on tourism exclusively, such as some of the communities that Patricia was talking about in her research. Next slide, please. So just some final thoughts around kind of hopes and concerns for the future. There's been a lot of information out there, and we're trying to do our best to put it out as well about using this as an opportunity to reset. And you'll be hearing, I'm sure, a little bit more about that from Appy. It is an opportunity to try and support diversification, and agri-tourism has been a big push in places like Vanuatu, for instance, over the last few years. Much less so in Fiji, but it's a real opportunity to try and relook at some of those models such that we're combining sources of revenue that support community resilience and support the skills that communities have naturally, both in terms of agriculture and in terms of hospitality, genuine hospitality. A lot of the market intelligence is saying that things like that in terms of higher value, commercially immersive outdoor experiences will be in demand. So we're hopeful that that can be used as an opportunity to drive that reset message home. It's also a good opportunity in Fiji to reflect on the significant barriers that Itauke-led businesses face, particularly in rural and marginalized areas, and to try and address those. So one of the big issues, and Patricia mentioned a little bit, the interest in starting your own business. Fiji is currently, I think, 101 in the ease of doing business rankings and sliding every year. And not only is there a very difficult business environment, but for any businesses who are living outside of the urban centers, it's almost impossible to wade through the regulatory framework around setting up your own businesses. And yet we have all of these people who have tourism expertise who would make great leaders of their own tourism businesses were some of those issues addressed. So there's definitely an opportunity to support individuals and communities with product and enterprise development, an area that hasn't been done too well in the past, but that's going to require a significant political will. And unfortunately, at the moment, there's not a huge amount of evidence that that's going to change anytime soon, which is something as the Duavata Sustainable Tourism Collective, we're trying very much to address. The recovery is likely to be protracted, and the domestic market is unfortunately insufficient to sustain most operators. So we're really pushing at the moment to look for alternative sources of revenue. So as the Duavata Sustainable Tourism Collective, we'll be launching next month a conservation leadership program, which is around supporting urban Fijians to connect to nature-based experiences, and trying to grow both the willingness and the awareness of the importance of this segment of the industry, not just for tourism, but for supporting future conservation and environmental efforts in the future, regardless of the space that might be. Tourism, marine policy, agriculture policy, these are all very interconnected issues. So I'll leave it there because I know we have a short amount of time, unfortunately, to chat, but just some thoughts from me.
Marita, thank you so much. That gives us another perspective and really is making this webinar today very multi-dimensional. So very much appreciate your presentation and the information and all the hard work that everyone is doing to try and figure this conundrum out that we live in today. Next, I'd like to introduce our next two. One is I won't say they're both academics. One's a pracademic, and one is an academic, apparently. So I will introduce them, and then we'll just start a couple of questions to get a conversation going. So first off, I'd like to introduce Lisa Pepe Matalolu, who is an Indigenous Fijian pracademic at the School of Tourism and Hospitality Management at the University of the South Pacific, a very dear place to my heart. Ms. Matalolu previously worked for Tourism Fiji in Australia and the United States of America. She is currently pursuing her doctoral thesis at the University of the South Pacific. Her research interests include Indigenous tourism and quality of life, tourism micro-entrepreneurship, and tourism in the Indigenous feminist perspective. Eli, welcome. Bula Vinaka.
Bula Kelly and Bula to colleagues from all around the world. I've just been asked to spend a bit of time on talking about Lawai village, pottery, and how it has dealt with COVID-19, running in line with the resilience theme that we're talking about this afternoon. Just to put things into perspective, the pottery village started in the 1960s, which says a lot about its resilience, run by a group of women from the village, and it continues to today. We are working with the People First Tourism Platform to continue the experiential journey that the tour provides for our tourists. The village sits right in the middle of the Coral Coast region, which is one of the more popular tourism regions in Fiji. And it's about an hour and a half from the Nandi International Airport. So the tour itself has done a couple of things that you see on the slide to make sure that it is adapting to what COVID-19 presents in terms of challenges. One of the things it's done, it's concentrated quite a lot on the domestic market, including primary and secondary schools as part of its efforts to diversify its revenue stream. It has been spending the last couple of months enhancing or improving its product. The example given there is partnering with the Fiji Arts Council to deliver a much more improved on-site experience. It has, through the field trips that the university has been having with the village, they've been able to invest resources into improving their tour bure, and that's something that will continue into the future. They obviously need to work on income diversification in terms of expanding the involvement of the women, in terms of other income generating projects. It's interesting to note that their business has remained open. Every morning it opens at 8 o'clock, 5 o'clock it closes, and it has continued to operate even against the backdrop of COVID-19. Second slide, please. So the lessons, we were asked to talk about some of the lessons, as you can see on the screen. I talked about diversifying revenue streams that the tour has taken. One of the things that the women have very quickly adapted to on the ground is to strengthen the partnerships that they have available. They've strengthened the partnership with USB. They've explored partnerships with the Singatoka Town Council, which is a local municipality, and they are exploring opportunities there as a way of strengthening the revenue stream for the tour. Social media has also become one of the key strengths of the tour. The women themselves are improving their own ability and skills when it comes to a better way of maximizing their presence on Facebook. And they're also investing into the existing infrastructure while they bid their time for the borders to open, while they're looking at enhancing their product, while they're looking at the domestic market, they are improving their existing infrastructure. And this is all in line with moving towards a more experiential part of the experience, where they showcase traditional pottery making skills to people that come into the village. Just as a matter of interest, the tour itself is a 2-hour tour that takes place inside a traditional Fijian village, where the guests come in, have an opportunity to walk around a Fijian village. They're welcomed, obviously, they're entertained, and they're given an opportunity for a hands-on experience in terms of making their own pottery. So Kelly, those are just some of the key ways in which the village has been handling and adapting and evolving their tour to tackle COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Ely, and good luck with that dissertation ahead of you. It's always a big undertaking. I'd like to. I think those are great strategies and some strategies that we can contemplate in a larger context. I'd like to, without further ado, go ahead and introduce Api, Dr. Api Movano, who joined Massey University at the start of 2020 after 10 years serving in various positions at the University of the South Pacific. Movano pursued a doctoral degree at Griffith University in Australia. His research has drawn on postmodernist techniques and seeks to improve our understanding of this idea of resilience and sustainable livelihoods, climate change, and tourism development amongst Pacific Island communities. He is currently a member of the development studies team at Massey in New Zealand as a senior lecturer. Welcome, Api.
Thank you, Kelly. And Mbulovina kia ora, from Palmerston North. I was a bit late to the party today, so I guess I have a couple of minutes just to share with you the madness that you see on my slides. It's quite crowded, but it's quite deliberate because we're going through a phase where we're called to question tourism, its setup, and its design, because it seems that very few people anticipated that such a shock, such as the global pandemic, would disrupt the entire socioeconomic order of our planet as we know it. And there could be many victims of this, but the research that I've been doing with colleagues, Professor Eugene Scavens and a couple of others in the region, has spurred us to seek out stories and seek out lessons from the Pacific on how they are adapting and reacting to the pandemic. Here before you, you'll see a number of snippets. The first, right at the top, sustainability as the new normal. This is the UNWTO One Planet's vision for the future of tourism. And it really sets the tone for thinking and actions regarding what we do post-pandemic. You've probably heard that immediately after the pandemic struck, people in the Pacific, in particular in Fiji, turned to bartering as a means to get by. And obviously with politicians and business people, everyone is eager to get back to the way things were, so we can all start making money again. The OECD is already thinking about how to get back to pre-COVID levels. And it's quite shocking that very few people are actually thinking beyond the box, beyond normal, because definitely post-pandemic tourism recovery requires a paradigm shift in how things are done. And the research that we've done supports this. We often read in the news that people in the Pacific are dependent on tourism, are suffering, are mere bystanders in all this. But to the contrary, the research that we've done has shown that people are aware of what's happening, they're aware of the resources around them, and are turning back to their traditional skills, their customary land, in order to survive. Next slide, please. Allow me to perhaps just share with you some of the findings of how people are actually reacting. And here we have direct quotes from the research that we did in Samoa, Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, the Cook Islands, and in Fiji. So as soon as the pandemic struck, we rekindled the connections that I had with the community where I spent the past 10 years conducting ethnographic research. This is in Watorolai village in the Coral Coast, one of the first villages to be engaged in tourism. But we also approached and employed research assistants, of which one presented today, Patricia Bibi. She undertook studies in one part of Fiji. We had research associates in the various countries interviewing, sitting down, having a talanoa. And really, people are aware that they need to restore and renew themselves, rekindle kinship with nature, forging closer bonds with their communities, getting to know their neighbors. And it's really making a significant improvement in their physical, spiritual, mental, cultural well-being. Although financial well-being was heavily impacted, and it impacted a lot of people negatively, I guess the theme that comes across from all of the countries are best demonstrated by the quote on the far right-hand side of our screen by this young Samoan gentleman who said, like our family, everyone else has gone back to the land. For some things, I've had to relearn skills that have not been used for years, skills in planting and especially in fishing. I'm very happy with the plantation of mixed crops I have now, and I'm feeling confident we will be okay moving forward in these times of uncertainty. And this really speaks to the majority of the responses that we received. And just to quickly summarize, people of the Pacific are opportunity-seeking people. They are adaptive by nature. They've never seen the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean as an issue or a problem. Our engineering feats, including the advent of the triangular-shaped sail of our double-hull canoes, speak to this spirit, which I am confident to sort of share, that it's very well and alive in how people have been able to adapt to life without tourism. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Appy. I'm just going to check in with my co-host here, Duarte. What kind of time do we have? Do we have time for some Q&A right now?
Thanks, Kelly. I've been taking notes on some themes of the questions on the chat, and I'll propose maybe we watch the video that you've shared with us. We take a bit of a cultural break. You can stand up a little bit. It takes about a little bit over 4 minutes. And maybe while I get ready, Kelly, if you want to introduce it, and then when that ends, we'll then have a good 30 minutes for Q&As.
Great, thank you. Well, this is, I was asked to deliver a short ecotourism video, and I just so happened that we have one. And this is about the project Rivers Fiji that I mentioned earlier. And it was done for really the purposes of bringing to light the value of ecotourism in the rural highlands. And we worked with a river conservation expert and filmmaker, Pete McBride, to deliver on this film and by and large influence government, but also bring awareness to this project and other projects like it. So thank you, Duarte.
Thanks, Kelly. So I think this will be a good way for us to kind of relax a little bit and just be ready for a good discussion after it.
The island dream I expected. Endless beach, sand, surf, sunsets, even fire. I didn't expect this. I've been lucky to have seen rivers around the world. I've even run a few, source to sea. So I guess I thought I'd seen what rivers could offer, and the natural artwork they sculpt upon our landscapes. Honestly, no description could have prepared me for this. What the native people here refer to as the highway to their ancestors. Some call it the River of Eden. Others say it is the tropical Grand Canyon. Here, in Fiji, the locals call it the Navua River. Beyond this undescribable beauty, something else lured me here. The Upper Navua River is the only protected river of its kind in the South Pacific.
When I was born, I heard stories about this area. This is like a route or road to all our ancestors up in this area. That's a good thing that we Rivers Fiji have protected it from other developments like extracting gravel, mining, of damming the whole river.
About 15 years ago, a small rafting company did the unthinkable. They convinced local landowners and the government that the long-term economic benefit of conservation and tourism outweighed the quick money from extracting their resources or damming their river. I came here to understand how so few people could protect such a spectacular corridor inside Fiji's volcanic heart.
The Upper Navua River Canyon is one of the most beautiful rivers on Earth. It is a tight, narrow canyon that probably is less than 20 feet wide in some places. It spans up to 250, 300 feet high. It has dark black canyon walls fringed with green palms and ferns with trickles of water and waterfalls throughout the whole course. During the rainy season, we easily never be out of sight upstream or downstream of a waterfall. And I've never been in a place where that is even remotely possible.
Welcome to my office. There are several approaches to conservation in Fiji. The approach that we've used here at the Upper Navua Conservation Area is with children. We anticipate that bringing the children out to experience benefits of grandparents or the elders' decision to protect the area, we hope will inspire them to continue to manage it well for tourism and also, more importantly, for future generations.
Conservation is something we have to wake up to every day and say, we have to protect this place. It's never a fight that is over.
Children of the Matangali that own land adjacent to the river to have to know its value and know that they have the power to protect it or to lose it.
A Fijian friend told me, you don't have to dig very deep into the Upper Navua Conservation Area to find gold. As the stewards of this ancestral river showed me, value not only surrounds them in the form of beauty, but it also supports them.
I can say it's my best friend. I treated the river with respect every day I step onto it.
This is the real Fiji.
Okay, well, welcome back. I hope everybody had an opportunity to stretch a bit and maybe grab a nice warm drink or a cup of kava. So, below kava. So now we have a bit of time to dive into some questions. And Duarte, did you want to say something before I get started?
I tried to share these with you earlier, but with chat was kind of difficult. So I was gonna maybe just give you a quick summary of what I took notes on, and then you can take it from there. Does this sound good?
Sounds great, yes.
All right, so a few quick points that stood out to me. It was a pretty active chat activity, so that was cool. One of the earlier things was from Patricia's presentation. She spoke of empowerment of women. Actually, several people talked about that. And one thing that I felt that seemed to maybe need clarification is what kinds of skills from that empowerment of tourism involvement helped them cope with the pandemic, right? In terms of maybe their role in decision making and their assets and things like that. There was a cool question also asking to elaborate on conflict. There were some issues related to, some comments related to conflict when tourism increases in communities. I think sometimes land belongs to some tribes and there are tribes in the same village, but there was conflict with that. Another, from just reading actually about some of the work of our panelists online, the decision making is complex in Fiji, right? Because these are communal companies or businesses that are part of the village collective. So if somebody could comment on that, on how decision making is done like this, it must be complex. As Marita mentioned, taking the time and doing things well. There's a very unique way the way that happens in Fiji. And then Birendra had, I think, the beginning of a good thread of discussion about reinvestment of tourism earnings. How do the villages, did they just reinvest everything, or did they have some assets that help them weather the lack of income? All right. And I'll
Right.
back to you.
Yeah, I think that sets us up well. I think, why don't we go ahead and start with that empowerment question? I think that's a really interesting concept, and we look at those dimensions that you mentioned, Patricia. But how do those actually play out in real life? And what are you seeing with that skill set in becoming more resilient to crises such as the one we're facing today? I'll turn it over to Patricia first, if you'd like to comment on that, and then certainly our other panelists, feel free to jump in.
Thanks, Kelly. Yes, I went over to Taveuni towards the end of last year for work on the project I'm currently on, and I met up with some of the women whom I had interviewed for my thesis. And because in Taveuni, the other thing is there's not really many tourists that go there. If anything, they receive maybe just less than 2% of the overall visitor numbers to Fiji. So for many of them, it was easy for them to just revert back to farming because they've got land for farming. So they have all gone back to farming. And with regards to the empowerment, it was what really stood out was their decision making, having to prioritize spending and in those areas. For those that were with children, for them it was just focused on the children, being able to send them to school, while with the interrupted income flow for the family. Yes, so it came out strongly when I visited a few of them on my trip over. Just being able to prioritize, and in terms of being many of them mentioned, we're very fortunate to be living out here in the rural because we live in our own homes, we don't pay rent and all that. Even though some of the financial commitments, to the village and to the church is seen as a burdensome for some, but we have our cash crops taking us through these hard times. Yes.
Thank you, Patricia. Marita or Ely or Api, would any of you like to comment on that as well? Otherwise, we could move on to. There's been some chat and I think this maybe has to do with the stresses that many are feeling because of COVID and the pandemic and the changes in employment structure. And I know here in the U.S., some aspects of domestic violence have actually gone up. And there was a comment made in the chat that we're seeing a lot of this in the news in Fiji and the South Pacific. And just wondering if anyone would like to comment on that and see if you have any insights as to some of the things that might be being done to assist in this area. Marita,
I'm
looks like you're back.
happy to give a quick comment. I mean, in terms of our own experience and just leading on from, what Patricia was talking about, one of the things we have seen is that providing the opportunity for women to lead in their communities as guides or as managers of the work that they're doing has has supported them to have increased confidence, both within their communities, but also sometimes within their own households in terms of relationships. I think one of the things that's a bit of a nuance, which is why there's not, a consistent narrative on this, particularly in the Fiji context, is that obviously not everybody has access to land or has access to strong social networks or strong communal networks, partly because of the land tenure system, partly because of the incredible diverse ethnic mix in the country. And so part of the challenge in giving a single narrative to what's going on is that whilst there has been a lot of positivity in people kind of returning to the land and reconnecting with their matangalis, relearning old skills, I think there's a bit of an invisibility, particularly amongst some parts of the country who weren't necessarily directly employed in the tourism industry, but may have had small businesses, whether that was catering businesses or supplying towels to hotels, or there's just such a myriad of small businesses that were dependent on the sector. And capturing that is more problematic because that's not as easy to see. It's easy to see the people who've lost their jobs in the big hotels and to connect to them in terms of understanding their needs. But many of the civil society organizations that are working in this space are facing an ever increasing number of people coming to them, facing challenges at home, facing pressures because of reduced income, and particularly around the return to school, that was very evident that people often, at the beginning of the year in Fiji, people need money to help pay for books for school, uniforms, etc. And so the pressures that many family members were facing was kind of evident through that. So I think there's still a lot that's unfolding. And I think part of the issue with that is just the protracted nature of, nobody in Fiji realistically thinks we're going to have any tourists this year. It's going to be a long road back. And so I think perhaps some of the, kind of early hopeful signs were also with the view that it would be a relatively quick, a year, 18 months road back, but that's increasingly looking less likely. So it is an important area that needs to be researched.
Thank you. It leads me to a question that I've been thinking about and wondering and trying to poke as with folks I know in Fiji for sure, but are there any actions being done at the national level or with the South Pacific Tourism Organization to really address some of these strategic needs that are, what's the communication like? What is, are there any designs, any talk of action? We've heard a little bit about a bubble, creating a bubble in the South Pacific, but not much more on that. So any thoughts from our panelists on what's being done at the national level as well as the regional level?
Happy, do you want to take the bubble question?
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks, Marita, for throwing the ball over to my side of the pitch. Yeah, for the different countries that we're actively doing research on, each country is taking its own approach. Samoa has a far more conservative approach, given that they had experienced the outbreak of measles, and they're very protective of their borders. Fiji and its consistent push to resume travel and open up a travel bubble with either Australia, New Zealand, which, as Marita mentioned, is highly unlikely anytime soon. But I think it's worth talking about Vanuatu because their strategic recovery policy is well integrated into the entire government framework. And not only is it cohesive in how it's being designed and implemented, it's also aligned to the broader sustainable development goals and agenda. Palau is another country that is way ahead of others in terms of trying to make travel carbon neutral and leading in terms of marine conservation. So really, different countries are are doing what they can to sustain themselves. Others are more, fixed on this idea that tourism must resume to how it was. And, I'm not hinting any particular country. I will probably say that it's Fiji. Whereas other countries, especially Vanuatu, and I direct your attention for those who are interested, please. Their documents are available publicly, and it's just inspiring to see, since they've moved on away from the small, less developed states category, they've really gone on to full gear in diversifying their economic prospects, strengthening their primary industries, and this people first approach to looking after their people, making sure that they're fed, and then tourism can complement these efforts. So I hope that provides some idea, or rather regional snapshot, if you will. Thank you, Kelly.
Just to add on to that, Kelly, at the regional level, there is a consultation going on at the moment that SBTO are leading on the development of a regional sustainable tourism framework. So if anybody on the call is interested in finding out, happy to share. That's on a platform called Solevaka. So if anybody's interested in contributing to the discussions that's happening over the next 3 to 4 weeks, and there's lots of resources on that site that give a bit of an update as to what's happening. But yeah, just to echo what Appy was saying about Vanuatu, I think they've shown some incredible leadership generally, and incredible leadership over the last year or so in really thinking about they already had a very strong sustainable tourism policy, and they've really used this opportunity to say, okay, well, now is the time to really drive this and to reset things.
Thank you so much. Yeah, really helpful to have that understanding. It does sound like it generates at a very local level and then moves up. So I think another question, we have about 10 minutes left. There's a question, oops, I just lost it. Sorry about that. What was the site Marita mentioned for sustainable tourism policy? Is there a site that you can put in the chat? Maybe thank you, you got it. Great. All right. Another question that's come up is this idea of rural versus urban communities. I think we've had a few indications that maybe those solely dependent on tourism in more urban areas might be feeling the pinch a bit more and have a little less adaptability, maybe a lot less adaptability. Any thoughts on just like in thinking about that holistically based on the stories that we've heard and the research that's been done about this idea of rural versus urban? And if so, are there strategies that could be employed? I think we heard a couple of interesting strategies that Denarau might be doing to help maybe those that are less fortunate and have less diverse capabilities as not having land and those kinds of things. So I'll kind of leave that open and hope to hear from each of our panelists on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kick off as a very much an urbanite in Suva, the capital. Obviously, Suva is a bit different because it's not a tourism dependent area, and most of the jobs in Suva are either public sector or large corporates, as well as many small businesses, but generally not dependent on the tourism sector. So I think the the area that's of particular concern is Nandi in the west and the areas where people were very heavily dependent on large hotel employment. And one of the arguments as Duavata, which we put in our March budget submission, which we put in our April budget submission, in our August budget submission, etc., was around the issue that it's a really important opportunity to be having the conversation about the fact that the tourism sector has never been very well connected to other sustainable development goals. It's always kind of the private sector's been left to do its thing. And at the government and policy strategic level, there's never really been an opportunity to say, well, how does the tourism sector relate to things like forest conservation, to water quality and water and sanitation issues. And one of the things that could be being done at the moment, if the funding that is being provided in unemployment benefits were being channeled through employers rather than through the pension fund as it's currently being done, is that many of those large hotels have amazing diversity of skill sets amongst their staff. You know, they're landscapers, they're nursery managers, they're energy managers, they're water quality officers, they're food safety officers. Those skills are in incredible demand generally across the country for a whole bunch of different development priorities. But we've not used this opportunity to say, well, hang on a minute, let's have a look. How much land are all of the different hotels that we have in the country sitting on? If we want to plant 30 million trees, which we say we do in government policies, let's use the land that those hotels have and neighboring communities that are attached to those hotels to really look at massive upscaling of agroforestry systems, which can provide food security support to communities, but also then incredibly interesting experiences for tourists when they come back. If we want to try and support communities to improve water and sanitation facilities, could we be using the staff of hotels to help do that? So for me, there's been a real absence of thinking about tourism holistically and using the current opportunity to think creatively about this incredible skill set that we have available to us now that could really be transforming the sector for the long term in terms of sustainability. You know, if we want to meet our climate change goals, which we talk about a lot at the international level, why are we not massively making available concessional finance to all of the hotels to adopt solar, to look at their waste and their water systems, etc. There's so much that we could be doing that unfortunately we need a little bit more political will to kind of drive.
Thank you. And anyone else? I think I get really excited in thinking about that possibility. Hopefully tourism in Fiji can be a voice and Duavada can be a voice for that initiative and get in the ears of politicians. I would like to, anyone else before I jump into the last segment, last few minutes of our time together?
Okay.
All right, then Kazim. I would like to actually ask Kazim and Jafar, I'm sure you have some burning questions as you sit there and listen to these amazing possibilities and presentations from our friends in the South Pacific. So I'd like to turn it over to you to ask, kind of close us out with some of your questions. Kazim?
Thank you, Kelly. I'm really enjoying this amazing talk and the consistency of the talk. So I picked up some words that just catch me and my mind. Your terms of political capital and Patricia's psychological empowerment of women, and thinking of Marita's diversity of income, not dominant role of tourism. And also when Api talked about the traditional knowledge and how they pass these techniques to the next generation. So it all is together is sustainability and is just within the principles of ecotourism. So my question is, in sustainable livelihood approach that we usually follow it as a research methodology, as a backbone of ecotourism development and community-based development, do you or can any of the panelists elaborate more about the institutional capital in case of Fiji? How these links happens? How you bring people together for traditional knowledge tourism, for example, how women can find their position for this psychological development. And if it's translated to political capital, how does it happen in terms of the institutional approach? I'm doing similar things. I have been teaching this in some other countries, but I know each destination and case has its own circumstances. But for sure, we can take lessons from the successful and the success models in each destination to share. I think many of my friends also have this question. So, yeah, anybody?
I might
yes, please.
jump in. So you mentioned in your question the sustainable livelihoods approach, which is, it's at the foundation of the research that I did and am doing, and I'm sure other colleagues are aware of how just significant this approach is, because it places people at the center of research and how they make a living, basically. And you'll note from the different presenters, we sort of speak from different cases in different parts of Fiji. So, first off, these are micro case studies in various different diverse parts of Fiji, different terrain, different weather, different types of tourism. And for some places that have been involved in tourism for more than 4 or 5 decades, these are areas where a lot of the traditional livelihoods activities have been foregone for a focus on tourism. And over 4 or 5 decades, livelihoods become limited. In fact, they become focused only on tourism. So such a shock disrupts these livelihood systems. But also within the sustainable livelihoods approach are the different resources available, whether it's human resources, spiritual resources, cultural resources, land, that people in not just Fiji, but across the Pacific are realizing the full potential. And towards the end of your question, the political systems, perhaps Patricia or Marita would can make links on or Ili on how the situation is on the ground. But yeah, it's complex in the Pacific. For Samoa, it's different. For the Cook Islands, it's different. And how people are responding to this by diversifying their livelihoods activities is encouraging. But people need money, right? And so I guess that's why we're having these conversations. How do we define this new normal? What will be the future of tourism? Will it be a more small scale, like the Talanoa trek setup? Is that something that we want? Potentially, yes. And yeah, perhaps other panelists would want to chip in.
Yeah, I think on the questions around, that where do people draw their knowledge and skills and resources from in terms of sustainable livelihoods? I mean, one of the amazing things about all communities in the Pacific are the very deep cultural and social networks and relationships. And I think that's something that often is not really well understood from the outside. Because that is a tremendous safety net in times of all crisis. So, we've had a terrible cyclone season in Fiji. We've already had 2 major cyclones this year. And regardless of the nature of the disaster, those relationships and those networks are very pervasive, they're deep-rooted, and they are available at times of crisis. And that also plays out a little bit in terms of the current context and some of the positive stories that are coming out about people reconnecting with their cultural heritage and skills. Lots of stories of of women learning how to fish, traditional methods that they've not used, within their lifetime, that they're learning from their mother when they go back to, a particular area. So there's definitely, I think, the crisis is an opportunity to kind of reflect on where do we see that kind of multidimensional, aspects to our livelihood sitting. And I think as families, many people are reflecting that perhaps, yes, they were, as Patricia was saying, too overly dependent on one source of income. The flip side to that is then obviously that those deep networks and vast networks in terms of social support are also now being drawn on. So, whereas one person would have been supporting perhaps 8 people within their family from their job, many people now in Suva are supporting the 8 people that they were already supporting, plus another 8 people potentially in the West who've lost their employment. So I think as we look at that in terms of resetting, one key thing for me is definitely a need to reset through that cultural lens, which has been absent, if I'm being honest, in terms of the way that tourism has developed in Fiji, and which is why Vanuatu is such an interesting case study at the moment, because that's what they're doing. They're really looking through that cultural lens, through the, the director there had a great quote at the conference that Pat and I were at last year, which is, we want tourism that is right for our communities, not communities that are right for tourism. And I think that is a really important way to look at the way that the recovery happens, and to learn some of the lessons that everybody's been sharing as part of the talk today.
If I could just add to what Api was saying, at the village level, the 3 main institutions are the family, the church, and the Vanua or the Matangali. And in the Lawai tour context, when it comes to the family, everybody is involved in the tour. The dad and the boys have to go and collect the clay that is required for the pottery to be made. From the church angle, the women's groupings in the church decide who is rotated to look after the tour bure every single day, because it's open from Monday to Saturday. And they use the church groupings to decide who is rostered on what day. And that's a very simple example how the 3 are very closely involved in the actual running of the tour.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give Jafar just a minute to go ahead and ask that burning question before we all say good night and good day.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly. First of all, I want to thank you for organizing this wonderful session. You began by saying something about cold weather in Utah. Well, it's minus 20 degrees centigrade here in Wisconsin, so you cannot make any claims over there. And it's just the beginning, going further down. I say centigrade because majority of people understand centigrade better than we in USA Fahrenheit. Kelly, I came to learn about the subject. I don't have the knowledge in the subject to make a contribution. But based on my limited view of the region we are talking about and the subject ecotourism, which is not in the core of my research and understanding, when we connect everything to the coronavirus, we are looking for answers. But what I have realized is we don't know what the questions are. We have got into a phenomenon in which we don't know what the question is, let alone searching for the answer. That's where I am with not only with ecotourism, but also about tourism in general, whether it is beach tourism, seaside tourism, nature tourism, safari tourism, whatever you call it. We don't know what the questions are. But I want maybe to end with Lisa Pace's comment that she brought the culture into the question and answer. And as an anthropologist, I certainly agree that we have to begin with culture. any change we want to make, we think we should make, it has to be born out of the culture. If the culture doesn't accommodate something, it's not going to happen. If the culture is not willing to be flexible, it's not going to happen. If we say this is the right way of doing it, but the culture thinks otherwise, it's not going to happen. So whether you call culture in the sense of culture and heritage, religion to me is also part of the culture. Valuing nature is part of the culture as well. So we sometimes have to go back to the core of this phenomenon, which is the culture, and any change we are talking about is going to be connected to culture change. Thank you. Again, thank you for the wonderful panel.
I have to unmute. Vinakavakalevu to all of our panelists, to certainly the group of people that made this happen today. There's a lot of behind the scenes that happens to make it all worthwhile for all of us to be here together. I feel like I've been rejuvenated in a way because I was able to touch base with voices from Fiji and really appreciate that connection once again. And I just want to again thank Ely, Patricia, Marita, and Professor Mavono for all the work that you all are doing to really bring to light some important strategies and issues related to sustainable tourism, whatever that means in whatever context that we are visiting that particular idea from. So again, Vinakavakalevu to everyone. Duarte, you have the last word. It's your show.
Thanks, Kelly. I'll be brief. It was a pleasure to be your host and your panelists and all the participants. I learned a lot on a recent paper from Pepe and Ely. They honed in on the communal structures of Fijian villages and on specific gender roles between men and women. And I think those were the things I was kind of looking for today. And I hope to continue to read about and hopefully visit the South Pacific and learn more and more, because we're all struggling to make it through this pandemic, and we just need to do our best to serve the people in our nearby communities and then learn from this for future crises, because they will keep coming. All right, so thank you, everybody. Good night, good day. And it was great. We'll see this recording online soon. Bye-bye.
Una demanda.
Una demanda. Demataka.
I need to learn these readings.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you so much.
Arigatou gozaimasu.
Arigatou gozaimashita. Thank you, everybody.
Tchauzinho a todos. Olá, Luísio. Tchau.